Welcome back, fellow history enthusiasts. Today, we delve into the cataclysmic climax of World War II in Europe, the Battle of Berlin. After relentless advancement across the German heartland, the Red Army stood poised to deliver the final blow against the Nazi regime. As the Western Allies, the British, French, and Americans, had already carved their paths through Western Europe, their gaze turned toward the final objectives. However, a stark difference in ideology and strategic priorities became evident. While the Western powers, already weary of war and wary of Soviet expansion, adopted a posture of caution and perhaps indifference toward a direct race to capture Berlin, the Red Army viewed the liberation of Berlin as a sacred mission, a necessary act of retribution and a symbolic triumph over the fascist enemy. The Western Allies, particularly General Eisenhower, made the strategic decision to halt their advance along the Elbe River. This choice was driven by several factors: a desire to minimize further Allied casualties, the assessment that Berlin held limited strategic military value once the broader war effort was won, and a growing concern about a potential Red Menace following the defeat of the Brown Menace. The race for Berlin was thus not just a military operation, it was a defining political maneuver that would shape the geopolitical landscape for the next half-century, setting the stage for the Cold War. For the Red Army, however, Berlin was everything. It represented the heart of the Third Reich, the source of the ideological poison that had ravaged the Soviet Union, killing over 20 million of its citizens and devastating its lands. The mission to take Berlin was steeped in a deep sense of historical retribution and national sacrifice. The Führer bunker in Berlin was the nerve center of the enemy command structure. Capturing it meant the absolute and unconditional end of the Nazi state. This essay explores how this final battle unfolded, from the meticulous planning of the Soviet High Command to the desperate last-stand defenses of the German capital, culminating in the complete collapse of the fascist empire and the subsequent reordering of Germany's future. The historical narrative of the final weeks of the war in Europe demonstrates not just military might, but also the psychological warfare, strategic calculations, and immense human cost that defined the era. As the war entered its final phase in early 1945, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, began meticulous preparations for the ultimate campaign, Operation Berlin. The objective was clear: obliterate the remaining German forces and seize Berlin before any other Allied power could claim a significant role in its fall. The sheer scale of the force mobilized for this offensive underscored the determination of Soviet leadership to end the war decisively and cement Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. The assembled force for the Berlin operation was staggering. The Red Army mobilized approximately 2.5 million soldiers, forming a colossal war machine designed to overwhelm the exhausted German defenses. This ground force was supported by 41,600 mortars and field artillery pieces, a firepower concentration unparalleled in modern warfare at that time. To spearhead the armored thrust, 3,255 rocket artillery launchers, including the fearsome Katyusha rockets, were deployed, alongside 6,250 tanks and self-propelled guns. The air support was equally immense, with 7,500 aircraft poised to dominate the skies and pound German positions. Crucially, this force also included over 200,000 Polish soldiers fighting alongside their Soviet counterparts, symbolizing a coalition against fascism. The offensive was designed as a pincer movement across three distinct axes, each led by one of the Red Army's most formidable marshals. Axis 1. The First Belarusian Front, Marshal Georgy Zhukov. As the primary assault force, Zhukov's front was given the most direct and challenging mission. Comprising 4 combined arms armies and 3 tank armies, along with extensive air support, Zhukov's forces were tasked with attacking the strongest German defensive positions directly east of Berlin. The main thrust aimed to shatter the German defenses on the Seelow Heights and push directly into the heart of the capital from the east. Zhukov's leadership was central to the operation, and he personally oversaw the intense fighting on the approaches to Berlin. The pressure on Zhukov was immense, as Stalin had explicitly set up a race between him and Marshal Konev. Axis 2, the Second Belarusian Front, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky. Positioned to the northeast of Berlin, Rokossovsky's forces had a crucial flanking role. His primary task was to engage the remaining German army group Vistula in Pomerania, preventing any attempts to relieve Berlin from the north. By pinning down these German forces, Rokossovsky ensured that Zhukov's main thrust would not be compromised by counterattacks from the flanks. The successful execution of this maneuver was vital in completely isolating Berlin from German reinforcements. Axis 3, the First Ukrainian Front, Marshal Ivan Konev. Konev's front, located to the south of Berlin, was a highly mobile and powerful force comprising 2 tank armies and multiple rifle armies. Konev's objective was initially to clear the German forces in Silesia and then to move rapidly northward. The race to Berlin was explicitly sanctioned by Stalin, allowing Konev's forces significant leeway to advance as far as possible. Konev's ultimate goal was not just to capture territory, but to compete directly with Zhukov for the honor of taking Berlin, a competition that had significant geopolitical implications. Stalin viewed this competition as a way to ensure maximum effort and speed from his most capable marshals. The political stakes were high, as the Soviet capture of Berlin would determine the future balance of power in Europe, solidifying the influence of Soviet socialism over the continent. With these preparations complete, the Red Army was ready. On April 16, 1945, the massive offensive began, targeting the last stronghold of the fascist regime. Faced with the overwhelming might of the Soviet offensive, the German High Command mounted a desperate final defense. The capital was protected by 2 major defensive lines, the Hennessy and Shoulder lines. Manned by a mixture of veteran soldiers and hastily assembled militia units. The German forces directly defending the approaches to Berlin comprised 48 infantry divisions, 6 panzer divisions, and 9 motorized divisions, along with various independent units totaling approximately 700,000 troops. Behind these frontline defenses, a mere 8 divisions served as the strategic reserve, a stark indicator of Germany's exhaustion after years of brutal warfare. The German defensive strategy relied on multiple layers of fortification. The primary defense line, known as the Oder-Neisse line, stretched for 20 to 40 kilometers deep, consisting of 3 continuous lines of trenches and fortifications. Beyond this, the inner defenses of Berlin itself were formidable. The city was divided into several defense sectors A, B, C, D, and E, each designed to be a self-sufficient fortress. Within the urban environment, a 3-tiered defense system was established, an outer ring, an inner ring, and a core ring surrounding the government district. Every street, every building, and every metro station was transformed into a potential strongpoint, creating a labyrinth of resistance for the attacking forces. The defenders were a motley crew, reflecting the Third Reich's state of collapse. While elite SS divisions, fanatical and highly motivated, formed the core of the resistance in key areas like the government district, much of the defense relied on the Volkssturm, People's Militia, and the Hitler Youth. These units consisted of elderly men and young boys, many poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and suffering from low morale. However, their desperation and indoctrination led to pockets of ferocious resistance, often under the direct supervision of SS officers who would execute anyone suspected of cowardice or desertion. The German leadership, particularly Adolf Hitler, entrenched in his bunker, viewed the battle as a final heroic stand. Hitler issued orders to defend the capital to the last man, a directive that resulted in immense civilian casualties and the needless destruction of the city. The German defenses were formidable, not in quality of manpower, but in their determination to fight to the bitter end, transforming Berlin into a vast urban battlefield. The offensive commenced in the pre-dawn hours of April 16, 1945. Zhukov's First Belarusian Front faced the most difficult task, breaking through the strong German defenses on the Seelow Heights. This area, a series of hills overlooking the Oder River Valley, was fortified by the German Army Group Vistula. Marshal Zhukov, aiming to maximize the psychological impact and disorient the enemy, ordered the use of 150 searchlights. As the initial artillery barrage subsided, these powerful beams were intended to blind the German defenders and illuminate the advancing Red Army soldiers, creating a terrifying spectacle for the enemy. The initial assault, however, did not go as planned. A thick fog blanketed the area, rendering the searchlights ineffective and causing confusion among the attacking Soviet troops. Furthermore, the German commander, General Gotthard Heinrichi, had anticipated the assault. He had shrewdly pulled back most of his forces from the front lines just before the Soviet barrage, minimizing the damage. The Red Army infantry and tanks advancing across the marshy terrain of the Oder lowlands were met with concentrated German counterfire from well-prepared positions on the heights above. The Battle of Seelow Heights proved to be one of the bloodiest engagements of the final campaign. The Soviet forces, particularly those in the lead tank armies, suffered heavy losses. The initial plan to quickly breach the defenses and race into Berlin stalled. The high casualties and slow progress led to a crisis of command for Zhukov. Stalin, impatient and already aware of Konev's rapid advance to the south, pressured Zhukov relentlessly to break through. The competition between Zhukov and Konev for the honor of taking Berlin added to the urgency. However, the sheer weight of Soviet numbers and firepower proved overwhelming. After 3 days of brutal close-quarters combat, the German defenses on the Seelow Heights finally crumbled. The German forces, exhausted and lacking reserves, were forced into a chaotic retreat. Approximately 210,000 German soldiers attempting to fall back toward Berlin found themselves enveloped by the Soviet forces from multiple directions. The path to Berlin was now open, and the city's fate was sealed. The rapid collapse of the central German command structure left Berlin exposed and isolated.
While Zhukov fought fiercely at Seelow Heights, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front achieved remarkable success on the southern flank. Konev's forces, facing less formidable defenses, executed a swift and decisive breakthrough across the Neisse River. The objective was initially to clear German forces in Saxony and Silesia. However, following the green light from Stalin to race for Berlin, Konev directed his tank armies northward. The speed and maneuverability of Konev's forces caught the German high command completely off guard. Konev's breakthrough created a massive pincer movement in coordination with Zhukov's advancing forces. As Konev moved north and Rokossovsky pinned down forces to the northeast, the strategic encirclement of Berlin began. By April 25, 1945, Berlin was completely surrounded. The German forces within the city were isolated from any potential reinforcements. The last remnants of the German command structure outside Berlin were decimated or captured. The Third Reich's military apparatus had effectively ceased to function as a unified force. The combined offensive strategy proved devastatingly effective. The three fronts, Zhukov's direct assault, Rokossovsky's northern flank protection, and Konev's southern breakthrough, created an irresistible pressure from the east. The Red Army's coordinated push into Berlin had rendered all remaining German countermeasures futile. The final hours of the empire were now counted in days. With the external defenses breached, the Red Army began the final phase of the operation, the battle for the city center. This was a brutal shift from open field warfare to urban combat, where every street corner and building became a miniature fortress. The fighting inside Berlin was characterized by desperate, close-quarters engagements, with German defenders utilizing guerrilla tactics from fortified buildings. The German resistance, though fragmented, was fanatical in certain areas. SS units, along with the Volkssturm, fought fiercely to defend key areas, including the Reichstag and the government district. The Red Army adapted its tactics to counter the urban resistance. Tanks and infantry were organized into small assault groups. These groups included engineers, sapper units, armed with flamethrowers and high explosives to clear buildings, as well as infantry carrying PPSH submachine guns for close-quarters fighting. The Soviet artillery and air forces provided continuous fire support, transforming Berlin into a landscape of rubble. The video notes that the Red Army's tanks "Hui diệt Bắc Vũ Hặc quân nước Đại Phang Trung Quốc đã biến các ban trên một đống đổ nát." This high-intensity bombardment, alongside the relentless close combat, systematically broke down German resistance. The desperation of the German defenders was palpable. They used every available resource: anti-tank weapons like Panzerfausts, small anti-tank rocket launchers, snipers, and improvised fortifications in subway tunnels. However, the Red Army's determination, backed by superior numbers and heavy armor, ultimately prevailed. The relentless pressure from the Soviet assault groups forced the German defenders to withdraw from building to building, street to street. One of the most symbolic battles took place at the Reichstag, the former German parliament building. The Reichstag had little practical military value at this point, but it held immense symbolic importance for both sides. For the Soviets, capturing the building meant destroying the very heart of the Nazi state. For the Germans, defending it became a last-ditch effort to preserve national honor. The battle for the Reichstag was one of the final, defining moments of the Battle of Berlin. On April 29, Soviet forces launched a direct assault on the heavily defended building. The fighting was fierce, with German defenders, primarily SS and foreign volunteers, resisting from every window, staircase, and rubble pile. Soviet tanks and artillery provided direct fire support, blasting large holes in the building's facade. The Air Force conducted relentless bombing runs, further reducing the Reichstag to ruins. Despite the desperate resistance, the Red Army soldiers eventually broke through. On April 30, 1945, two Soviet soldiers, Sergeant Mikhail Yegorov and Junior Sergeant Meliton Kantaria, successfully scaled the building and planted the Soviet flag, a red banner emblazoned with the Hammer and Sickle, on top of the Reichstag dome. This act was captured in an iconic photograph that quickly became a powerful symbol of Allied victory and the collapse of the Third Reich. The sight of the red flag replacing the swastika was a powerful message to the world that the fascist regime had met its end. As the Red Army closed in on the government district, Adolf Hitler, hidden deep within the Führer bunker, realized all hope was lost. Faced with inevitable capture by the Soviets, Hitler chose suicide rather than surrender. On April 30, 1945, Hitler took his own life, along with his new wife, Eva Braun. Their bodies were reportedly burned in the Chancellery Garden by remaining staff members, following Hitler's specific instructions to avoid being paraded by the enemy. With Hitler dead and the Reichstag captured, the final strongholds of the German resistance began to crumble. The Battle of Berlin formally concluded on May 2, 1945, when General Helmut Weidling, the commander of the Berlin defense area, issued the final order to surrender. The remaining German forces, lacking leadership and supplies, laid down their arms. However, the formal end of the war required a larger process. On May 7, 1945, General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Staff of the German Armed Forces High Command, OKW, signed the unconditional surrender document at Reims, France, effectively ending the war in Europe. This document was signed in the presence of representatives from the United States, Great Britain, and France. However,
Marshal Joseph Stalin, deeply offended that the surrender took place outside of Berlin and without the direct leadership of a top Soviet marshal, refused to accept this as the final official surrender. Stalin insisted that the formal surrender ceremony reflect the Soviet Union's immense contribution and sacrifice in defeating Nazi Germany. He demanded a separate ceremony in Berlin itself, presided over by a top Soviet representative, Marshal Georgy Zhukov. On May 8, 1945, representatives of all Allied powers gathered in Berlin to oversee the formal surrender. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the OKW, signed the second unconditional surrender document in the presence of Marshal Zhukov, representing the Soviet Union, and other Allied representatives from Britain, France, and the United States. This second surrender, effective on May 9, 1945, marked the official conclusion of the war in Europe. The immediate aftermath of the war in Berlin was one of profound devastation and humanitarian crisis. Berlin was a city in ruins, with massive infrastructure damage, food shortages, and a population suffering from psychological trauma. The video correctly notes that the German people were pushed to the brink of survival, with the economy collapsing and a scarcity of vital supplies. The majority of the male working-age population had either died on the front lines or were held as prisoners of war. In the midst of this chaos, Marshal Zhukov, acting as the head of the Soviet military administration in Germany, took immediate steps to stabilize the situation in the Soviet zone of occupation. The video highlights several key directives issued by Zhukov in May 1945. Directive number 063, May 11th, focused on providing emergency food supplies to the population of Berlin. Directive number 064, May 12, addressed the restoration and normalization of essential public services within Berlin. Directive number 080, May 31st, concerned the provision of milk to children in Berlin. These measures were part of a larger effort by the Soviet Union to transition from military occupation to political stabilization. The Soviet government dispatched large quantities of essential supplies to Berlin, including 96,000 tons of grain, 60,000 tons of potatoes, nearly 50,000 head of livestock, and thousands of tons of other food products. The Soviet military administration prioritized restoring order and providing aid, particularly in the Soviet sector of Berlin, which would eventually become the capital of East Germany, or GDR. However, the post-war situation was fraught with complexity. While Soviet aid was provided to prevent mass starvation and disease, the economic recovery of Germany as a whole was hindered by several factors. The victorious Allies, including the Soviet Union, extracted reparations in the form of industrial equipment and resources. For the Soviets, this was seen as a necessary compensation for the devastation wrought by the German invasion. The denazification process, intended to eliminate Nazi influence from German society, was implemented differently across the various occupation zones, Soviet, American, British, and French, leading to ideological conflicts and the eventual division of Germany into two separate states. The Battle of Berlin in April and May 1945 was more than just a military victory. It was a symbolic climax that marked the definitive end of Nazi tyranny and fundamentally reshaped the 20th century. The immense sacrifice of the Red Army and the strategic brilliance of its marshals brought about the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich. The fall of Berlin confirmed the triumph of Allied forces over fascism. However, the victory in Berlin also initiated a new era of global conflict. The race to Berlin between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union exposed the deep ideological chasm that would soon widen into the Cold War. The occupation and division of Germany became a central point of contention between the two superpowers, leading to the construction of the Berlin Wall and decades of political tension. Looking back, The Battle of Berlin stands as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of ideological extremism and the immense cost of modern warfare. The resilience of the soldiers who fought on both sides, the desperation of the final days, and the subsequent efforts to rebuild a shattered nation all contribute to a complex legacy. The fate of Germany was determined in those final weeks, setting the stage for a new world order defined by the rise of two opposing superpowers and the subsequent struggle for global influence.